The Valkyrie Dominion had conquered 1,247 worlds across the galaxy, and not once had they failed in their mission of expansion and control. Admiral Keth Oren stood tall on the command bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Supremacy, watching the blue and green planet rotate slowly below his fleet. He felt nothing but cold contempt for the primitive creatures that lived on its surface, and he allowed himself a thin smile as he considered how easy this conquest would be. 3,000 warships hung in the darkness of space around Earth, their sleek hulls gleaming under the light of the yellow sun. Each vessel carried enough firepower to burn entire continents, and together they formed the largest invasion force the Dominion had ever assembled for a single world, not because they needed such power, but because the High Council wanted to make an example of this species called humanity. The intelligence reports had been very clear about what they faced here. Earth was classified as a Category 7 primitive world, which meant its inhabitants had barely managed to escape their own gravity well and venture into space. They possessed crude nuclear weapons and laughable chemical rockets, and their civilization was fractured into dozens of squabbling nation-states that could not even agree on basic matters of governance. Keth Oren had studied the reports with growing boredom. These humans had spent most of their short history killing each other over patches of dirt and abstract ideas, and they had never once faced a threat from beyond their world. They were isolated, ignorant, and completely unprepared for what was about to happen to them. "Begin the broadcast," the Admiral commanded, and his communications officer nodded in acknowledgement before activating the translation systems. The message went out in every human language simultaneously, transmitted through every radio frequency, television channel, and digital network on the planet. It was the standard surrender ultimatum that the Dominion had used on countless worlds before, and it had never once failed to bring a species to its knees. "People of Earth," the message began, "you are now subjects of the Valkyrie Dominion. Your planet has been claimed in the name of the High Council, and you will submit to total annexation within 12 hours. Failure to comply will result in the complete extinction of your species. Resistance is not advised, as your primitive weapons cannot harm our vessels. Surrender your leaders and prepare for integration into the Dominion, and you may be permitted to survive as a servant race. This is your only warning." Keth Oren watched the planet below and waited for the inevitable response. On every other world, this moment had been followed by panic, confusion, and desperate attempts at negotiation. Leaders would beg for mercy, populations would riot in fear, and within hours the target species would be fighting among themselves as much as they fought the idea of submission. But as the minutes passed, something strange began to happen on the surface of Earth. The Admiral's sensors detected a sudden surge of activity across the planet. Not panic, not chaos, but coordination. Military forces that had been pointed at each other for generations suddenly began to communicate. Old enemies established direct lines of contact. Encrypted transmissions flew between governments at a rate the Valkyrie analysts could barely track. "What are they doing?" asked Subcommander Veltrix, confusion evident in her voice. Keth Oren narrowed his eyes and leaned forward in his command chair. He had conquered enough worlds to recognize military mobilization when he saw it. But this was something different. This was happening too fast, too smoothly, as if the humans had been waiting for exactly this moment. Down on Earth, the leaders of nations that had threatened each other with nuclear annihilation just hours before were now sitting in emergency conference calls. Generals who had spent their careers planning wars against neighboring countries were sharing intelligence and coordinating defense strategies. Scientists who had competed for funding and prestige were pooling their knowledge and resources. In Moscow, an aging president looked at his American counterpart through a video screen and spoke words that would have been unthinkable. Just one day earlier, "It seems we finally have a common enemy. My friend, Shall we show these invaders what happens when humanity stops fighting itself? In Beijing, military commanders began uploading their satellite data to shared servers that could be accessed by anyone on Earth. In London, intelligence agencies released classified information about their space observation capabilities. In New Delhi, nuclear launch codes were placed under joint international control. The humans were not panicking. They were organizing. Admiral Keth Oren felt a small flicker of unease in his chest, but he pushed it aside. It did not matter how quickly these primitives organized their pathetic defenses. They had nothing that could threaten his fleet, and their unity would shatter the moment the bombardment began. They have spirit, he admitted to his officers, but spirit alone cannot stop plasma cannons and orbital strikes. Prepare the fleet for the first purification bombardment. We will teach these creatures the cost of defiance. The 12-hour deadline had not yet passed, but Kethoran was not a patient being. He had seen the way the humans were responding, and he wanted to crush their hope before it could grow into something more dangerous. Target their largest cities, he commanded, but leave enough survivors to spread fear among the rest. I want this species broken and begging within the week. As the Valkyrie warships powered up their weapons and selected their targets, something unprecedented was happening on the blue planet below. For the first time in 10,000 years of recorded human history, every nation on Earth had agreed on exactly one thing. They would not surrender. They would not submit. They would fight with everything they had, and if they were going to die, they would make sure the invaders remembered the name of their world for the rest of eternity. In military bases and research facilities, in government bunkers and university laboratories, in ordinary homes and crowded streets. 8 billion human beings looked up at the sky with the same expression on their faces. Not fear, not despair, but something far more dangerous. It was the cold, calculating fury of a species that had been killing and surviving and adapting since the first of their kind picked up a rock and used it as a weapon. It was the inherited memory of 1,000,000 battles fought across every continent. It was the stubborn refusal to accept defeat that had carried humanity through ice ages and plagues and wars that should have destroyed them. Admiral Keth Oren did not recognize that look. He had never seen it before on any of the worlds he had conquered, but he would learn to fear it soon enough. The first bombardment came without warning, and 12 of Earth's greatest cities burned under alien fire. New York, Tokyo, London, Mumbai, Shanghai, Cairo, Sao Paulo, Moscow, Paris, Berlin, Sydney, and Los Angeles, each one struck by plasma beams that fell from the sky like the anger of vengeful gods. Millions died in the first few minutes, and millions more would die in the fires and chaos that followed. Admiral Keth Oren watched the destruction with satisfaction, certain that this display of overwhelming power would break the human spirit and force them to accept the inevitable. On every other world, such devastation had been enough to end all resistance within hours. But as the smoke rose from the burning cities, the Admiral noticed something that made him pause. The humans were not running. They were not surrendering. They were not even panicking in the way he expected. Instead, the survivors were already organizing rescue operations, pulling people from the rubble, setting up emergency shelters, and coordinating medical care. The military forces that remained intact were not retreating but repositioning, taking cover and preparing for the next phase of combat. And then the missiles came. Every nuclear-armed nation on Earth launched at the same moment, sending hundreds of warheads screaming toward the Valkyrie fleet in orbit. The timing was perfect, the coordination flawless, and for a brief moment, the darkness of space was filled with trails of fire and fury. Kethoran laughed as his ship's shields flared to life, deflecting the primitive weapons with contemptuous ease. The nuclear warheads detonated harmlessly against energy barriers that had stopped far more advanced attacks on 1,000 other worlds. Is that the best they can do? The admiral asked his officers, and the bridge crew joined in his amusement at the pathetic human attempt at resistance. But even as the Valkyrie celebrated their easy victory, something was happening down on Earth that would change the course of the war. In universities and research facilities across the planet, scientists were studying the data from the failed missile attack with intense focus. They had known their weapons would not penetrate the alien shields, but that was not the point. The point was to gather information. Every telescope on Earth had been pointed at the fleet during the attack, recording the exact frequencies at which the shields had activated. Every radar system had tracked the energy signatures. Every sensor had captured data about how the alien technology worked. Within hours, this information was being shared openly across the entire planet. Research teams in Japan compared notes with engineers in Germany. Physicists in India collaborated with programmers in Brazil. Military analysts in America worked alongside scientists in Russia. The humans were treating the invasion like a problem to be solved, and they were throwing the combined intellectual power of their entire species at finding a solution. Admiral Keth Oren received reports about this activity, but dismissed them as meaningless. What could these primitives possibly learn from a single failed attack, and what could they possibly build that would threaten his advanced warships? He did not understand that he was facing a species that had gone from horses and swords to nuclear weapons and space travel in less than 200 years. He did not comprehend that humans had evolved not through strength or speed, but through their terrifying ability to learn, adapt, and overcome. The second wave of missiles came 3 days later, and this time something was different. The warheads were wrapped in improvised electromagnetic scramblers, built from designs that had been shared freely across the internet. They broadcast interference patterns specifically tuned to disrupt the frequencies the aliens use for their shields. Keth Arn watched in disbelief as 3 missiles actually penetrated his fleet's defenses and detonated against the hull of a support vessel. The damage was minor, barely worth noticing, but the implications were staggering. No primitive species had ever adapted this quickly. No conquered world had ever managed to hurt the Dominion ships within days of first contact. How is this possible? Demanded Sub-Commander Veltrix, her voice tight with something that might have been fear. The Admiral had no answer, but he knew he could not allow this development to continue. If the humans could learn this much in just 3 days, what might they accomplish in 3 weeks or 3 months? Prepare the ground forces, Ketharin ordered, his voice cold and hard. We will take this planet the old way, with soldiers and blood. I want every human population center occupied within the month. 2 million Valkyrie warriors descended to Earth in drop pods, their confidence unshaken by the minor setbacks in orbit. They were elite soldiers from a species that had never lost a ground war, armed with weapons that could vaporize a human from a kilometer away, protected by personal shields that could stop any projectile the primitives might throw at them. They expected to find terrified civilians and disorganized resistance fighters, easy prey for the greatest military force in the galaxy. What they found instead would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The first landing zones were in open areas, far from the major cities, where the Valkyrie commanders expected to establish secure bases before pushing into populated regions. They chose locations with good sightlines and defensible terrain, following protocols that had worked perfectly on hundreds of other worlds. But the humans had been watching the descent from orbit, tracking every drop pod, predicting every landing zone. By the time the Valkyrie soldiers emerged from their pods and began to organize, they were already surrounded. The attacks came from everywhere at once, from buildings that had seemed abandoned, from forests that had appeared empty, from underground tunnels that did not show up on alien sensors. Human soldiers used weapons ranging from advanced military hardware to hunting rifles to improvised explosives. The Valkyrie personal shields stopped bullets easily enough, but the humans had already figured out that the shields needed time to recharge between impacts. They organized their fire to hit the same target in rapid succession, overwhelming the protective barriers through sheer volume. And when their ammunition ran out, some of the humans did not retreat. They charged forward with knives, with clubs, with their bare hands. General HFY, commanding the ground forces in what had once been called Europe, sent a frantic transmission to the fleet. These creatures are insane. They do not fight like any species we have encountered. They show no fear. They refuse to surrender, and they treat death as an acceptable price for taking one of us with them. Admiral Kethorn read the reports with growing unease. Something had gone terribly wrong with this invasion, and he was beginning to suspect that the intelligence briefings had missed something very important about the nature of humanity. But it was too late to turn back now. The Valkyrie Dominion had never retreated from a conquest, and Kethorn would not be the first admiral to break that tradition. The war for Earth had only just begun, and the galaxy was about to learn why some worlds are better left alone. The Valkyrie had evolved on a paradise world called Valkar Prime, where the temperature never dropped below 20 degrees and never rose above 30. Their planet had gentle gravity, calm weather, and an ecosystem that had produced no significant predators for millions of years. They were tall and graceful beings, with long limbs and delicate features that spoke of a species that had never needed to fight for survival. Their intelligence had developed through cooperation and social organization, not through the brutal competition that shaped most sentient life in the galaxy. When they first ventured into space, they had been shocked to discover how violent and dangerous most of the universe was. World after world seemed designed to kill anything that lived on it, and the species they encountered were often savage and unpredictable. But the Valkyrie had technology and numbers on their side, and they had learned to conquer through overwhelming force rather than adaptation. They did not need to understand their enemies. They simply needed to destroy them. This approach had worked perfectly for thousands of years across more than 1,000 worlds, and the Dominion's military commanders had grown comfortable in their superiority. They had forgotten that there was a reason why some species were so violent and dangerous. Earth taught them that lesson in blood and fire. The problems began almost immediately after the ground invasion started. The Valkyrie soldiers found themselves struggling to breathe in Earth's atmosphere, which contained trace elements that irritated their lungs. The gravity was nearly twice what they were accustomed to, and their bodies began to tire after just a few hours of activity. In Russia, a battalion of elite Valkyrie warriors marched into a region called Siberia during what the locals described as a mild winter. The temperature was -15 degrees, with light snow falling from a gray sky. Within 6 hours, every single soldier in that battalion was dead from hypothermia. Their bodies simply shut down in temperatures that human children played in every day. In Brazil, a company of Valkyrie engineers set up a base camp in the Amazon rainforest, confident that their advanced technology would protect them from any local threats. Within a week, half of them were dead from infections caused by bacteria their immune systems had never encountered, while the rest were being slowly driven mad by insects that found alien blood just as tasty as human blood. In Australia, a squad of scouts reported contact with local wildlife and requested immediate extraction. Their final transmission included screaming about venomous everything and a creature called a drop bear that their weapons could not seem to stop. The Valkyrie commanders began to realize with growing horror that Earth was not a Category 7 primitive world. It was a Category 1 death world that had somehow been miscategorized. This planet was actively hostile to life in ways that defied comprehension. It had extreme temperature variations, unpredictable weather patterns, deadly microorganisms everywhere, and an ecosystem filled with creatures that seemed designed specifically to kill. And the humans had evolved here, had survived here, had thrived here for hundreds of thousands of years. General Yevrai studied the reports from his failing campaign and began to understand why the humans fought the way they did. They were not insane, they were simply products of their environment. Every human being alive was descended from countless generations of survivors who had fought off predators, endured famines, survived plagues, and killed each other in wars that would have wiped out any other species. Weakness had been bred out of them through millions of years of relentless natural selection. Their bodies could operate in temperature ranges that would kill most galactic species. They could survive injuries that would be fatal to Valkyrie soldiers. They could go without food for weeks, without sleep for days, and still remain functional enough to fight. And their minds were even more terrifying than their bodies. The humans had a concept they called spite, the willingness to harm yourself if it meant harming your enemy more. They would crash vehicles into Valkyrie positions knowing they would die in the explosion. They would hold grenades against their own chests and charge into groups of alien soldiers. They would keep fighting with limbs missing, with blood pouring from their wounds, with death just moments away. One report described a human soldier who had been shot through the chest and was clearly dying. Instead of accepting his fate, he crawled 300 meters through mud and fire to reach a Valkyrie communications relay, which he destroyed with his bare hands before finally collapsing. Another report told of a human female, a civilian with no military training, who had killed 2 Valkyrie soldiers with a kitchen knife after they broke into her home. She had been shot 6 times during the fight and was still trying to stab a 3rd soldier when reinforcements arrived. The Valkyrie had never encountered anything like this. The species they had conquered in the past had always broken eventually, had always reached a point where survival instinct overrode resistance. But humans seem to have no such limit. They treat war as natural. General Yevrai wrote in his final report to Admiral Kethorn, "They do not fear it or avoid it, they embrace it. They have been killing each other for so long that violence is written into their very souls. We thought we were invading a primitive world, but we have awakened something ancient and terrible. The ground war was supposed to be over in a month." After 6 weeks, the Valkyrie controlled less territory than they had on the first day. For every position they captured, they lost 2 others to counterattacks. For every human they killed, 10 more seemed to appear from nowhere. For every weapon they destroyed, the humans built 3 more from salvaged parts and scrap metal. And worst of all, the humans were learning. Every battle taught them more about Valkyrie tactics, technology, and weaknesses. Every captured weapon was immediately reverse-engineered and studied. Every dead alien soldier was examined by human scientists who wanted to understand exactly how to kill more of them. The hunters had become the hunted, and the greatest military force in the galaxy was slowly being bled to death by a species they had dismissed as primitive savages. Admiral Kethorn looked at the casualty reports and felt something he had never experienced before in his long career of conquest out. For the first time, he began to wonder if this invasion had been a terrible mistake. 6 weeks after the invasion began, Admiral Kethorn received a transmission from the Valkyrie High Council demanding to know why Earth had not yet been conquered. He had no good answer to give them. The ground war had become a nightmare of ambush, guerrilla attacks, and constant harassment. The orbital bombardment had proven ineffective against enemies who lived in tunnels and bunkers. And the human population showed no signs of surrendering, no matter how many of them died. But the Admiral still believed that time was on his side. The humans were clever and dangerous, but they lacked the technology to truly threaten his fleet. As long as he controlled the space above Earth, eventual victory was assured. He was wrong. In secret locations around the world, the greatest minds of human civilization had been working on a single desperate project. They called it Operation Thunder, and it was humanity's last and best hope for survival. The project had begun with captured Valkyrie technology weapons, shields, and communications equipment recovered from dead soldiers and destroyed vehicles. Human engineers had taken these devices apart piece by piece, studying every component, analyzing every circuit, learning how alien science worked. A physicist in Mumbai named Dr. Priya Sharma made the crucial breakthrough. She discovered that the Valkyrie shields operated on a specific energy frequency that could be disrupted by a precisely tuned electromagnetic pulse. The frequency was complex, but not impossible to replicate with human technology. In Snow Polo, a 17-year-old programmer named Carlos Santos wrote the targeting algorithm that would guide the new weapons. He worked for 3 days without sleep, fueled by coffee and rage, and produced code that was elegant enough to make professional engineers weep with admiration. In Shenzhen, a factory that had once made smartphones was converted to produce shield-disrupting missiles. The workers operated around the clock in 12-hour shifts, knowing that every weapon they built brought their species one step closer to survival. In secret military bases across America, Russia, and China, captured Valkyrie full drives were being installed in human spacecraft. These devices allowed ships to travel faster than light, and the humans had figured out how to make them work with their own vessels. Through a combination of brilliant engineering and complete disregard for safety protocols, the human scientists did not fully understand the alien technology. They did not have time for full understanding. Instead, they used trial and error, intuition, and pure determination to make things work. Dozens of researchers died in accidents during the development process, and each one was immediately replaced by another volunteer. Admiral Keth Oren knew none of this. His intelligence officers had reported unusual activity in human industrial centers, but they had dismissed it as meaningless. What could primitives possibly build that would matter against Valkyrie warships? The answer came at dawn on the 43rd day of the invasion. Thousands of missiles launched simultaneously from hidden bases across Earth's surface. These were not the crude nuclear weapons the humans had used before, but something far more dangerous. Each one carried a payload specifically designed to disrupt Valkyrie shield technology. Cathorn watched in confusion as the missiles approached his fleet. He ordered his ships to activate their shields, confident that the energy barriers would stop any human weapon just as they had stopped everything else. The shields flickered to life, glowing with protective energy, and then something impossible happened. They failed. The shield-disrupting missiles did their job perfectly, broadcasting electromagnetic interference that overwhelmed the alien defensive systems. For the first time since the invasion began, Valkyrie warships hung naked and vulnerable in orbit. The second wave of missiles arrived moments later, and these ones carried nuclear warheads. The eternal supremacy shook violently as explosions tore through the fleet. Admiral Kethoran grabbed his command chair for support and stared at the tactical display in disbelief as ship after ship was destroyed. The humans had killed more Valkyrie vessels in 5 minutes than the Dominion had lost in the previous century. How is this possible? He screamed at his officers, but none of them had an answer. At the same moment, resistance cells across Earth launched coordinated attacks on every Valkyrie ground position. The humans had spent weeks studying alien patrol patterns and communication codes, and they used this knowledge to strike with devastating precision. In Europe, a combined force of soldiers from 12 different countries overwhelmed the main Valkyrie command base. In Asia, guerrilla fighters destroyed every alien supply depot within 1,000 kilometers. In Africa, civilians armed with captured weapons rose up against their occupiers in a synchronized uprising that caught the invaders completely off guard. The Valkyrie ground forces found themselves cut off, surrounded, and under attack from every direction. Their communications were jammed, their reinforcements were not coming, and their enemies showed absolutely no mercy. Admiral Keth Orn watched his army being destroyed on the surface while his fleet burned in orbit. And he made the only decision he could make. He ordered a full retreat. But the humans were not finished with them yet. A ragtag fleet of human spacecraft rose from Earth's surface cargo shuttles modified for combat, military spaceplanes loaded with weapons, even civilian vessels whose owners had volunteered for what everyone assumed would be a suicide mission. Each one carried captured Valkyrie full drives and crews who had received only a few days of training. These ships were crude and dangerous and should not have been capable of threatening a real warship. But they had one advantage the Valkyrie did not expect. They were crewed by humans, who did not care if they lived or died as long as they took enemies with them. The human fleet pursued the retreating Valkyrie into space, harassing them at every opportunity, destroying damaged ships that fell behind, and making sure the invaders knew they were not simply being allowed to leave. Admiral Keth Orn watched on his sensors as human vessels appeared behind his fleet, ahead of his fleet, and on every side. They were everywhere, relentless and furious, and they clearly intended to follow him all the way back to Valkyrie space if necessary. He had come to Earth expecting an easy conquest. He was leaving with less than a third of his original force, and the humans were making sure he paid for every kilometer of his retreat. The galaxy had never seen anything like this, a primitive species not only surviving a Dominion invasion but actually winning, actually counterattacking, actually pursuing a retreating fleet with captured technology they had barely learned to use. As his flagship limped toward the fold space boundary with human missiles exploding all around it, Admiral Keth Orn realized that everything the Dominion believed about the universe had just been proven wrong. Some species were not meant to be conquered. Some worlds were not meant to be invaded. And some sleeping giants were not meant to be awakened. The humans had taught him this lesson at the cost of 1,000 ships and 2 million soldiers. And he knew with terrible certainty that the galaxy would never be the same. Of the 3,000 warships that had invaded Earth, only 17 made it back to Valkyrie space. Admiral Keth Orn was not among the survivors. His flagship, the Eternal Supremacy, had been destroyed during the retreat when a human pilot deliberately crashed a cargo shuttle into its engine section. The pilot's final transmission had been a single word that the translation systems could not properly interpret, but linguistic analysts later determined it was something called a profanity. The survivors who did make it home were immediately quarantined and subjected to intense interrogation. The High Council wanted to know everything about what had happened, every detail of the disaster that had cost the Dominion more ships and soldiers than any campaign in recorded history. The testimonies were disturbing beyond anything the Council had ever heard. One officer described watching human soldiers continue fighting after receiving wounds that should have killed them instantly. Another told of civilians who threw themselves onto Valkyrie positions, armed with nothing but farming tools and fury. A third spoke of the terrible sound human soldiers made when they attacked, a rhythmic shouting they called war cries, that seemed designed purely to terrify their enemies. They are not a civilized species, one survivor concluded in his report. They are predators wearing the mask of civilization. Beneath their technology and culture lies something ancient and savage that we awakened when we attacked their world. I recommend that no Valkyrie vessel ever approach Earth again. The High Council reviewed the reports and made a decision that had never been made before in the history of the Dominion. They classified Earth as unconquerable and forbade any future invasion attempts. But the Valkyrie were not the only ones watching. The Galactic Council was an assembly of the 700 most powerful civilizations in known space, and they had been monitoring the Earth invasion with great interest. Most of them had expected the usual outcome, another primitive world crushed beneath the Dominion's military might. Instead, they had witnessed something unprecedented, a species that should have been easy prey, not only surviving but actually winning. actually pushing back an invasion force, actually pursuing their attackers into space with stolen technology. Emergency sessions were called, and representatives from across the galaxy debated what to do about this newly discovered threat. The discussions went on for months, and the conclusions they reached would shape galactic politics for generations. Earth was reclassified from Category 7 Primitive World to Category 0 Existential. Threat: do not engage under any circumstances. This was the most severe threat classification that existed, reserved for species so dangerous that contact with them was considered unacceptably risky. In the entire history of the Council, only 3 other species had ever received this designation, and 2 of them had eventually destroyed themselves. Some representatives argued for a preemptive strike, gather every available fleet and destroy humanity before they could spread beyond their home system. The humans had proven themselves capable of rapid technological advancement, and if they were allowed to develop for another century, they might become truly unstoppable. But the military analysts presented their calculations, and the numbers were terrifying. Even with every warship in the galaxy combined, a direct assault on Earth would likely fail. The humans had already demonstrated their ability to adapt to new threats, and they would almost certainly find a way to survive and retaliate. We saw what they did with 6 weeks of preparation, one analyst argued. Imagine what they will do if we give them time to truly prepare for war. They will build weapons we cannot imagine and strategies we cannot anticipate. Attacking them would not solve the problem. It would only make them angry. In the end, the Council chose a different approach. They would pretend Earth did not exist. Trade embargoes were established around human space. Communication blackouts were enforced. Any ship that approached the Sol system without authorization would be destroyed by the Council's border patrol. The humans would be isolated and contained until the galaxy could figure out how to deal with them. This strategy lasted exactly 11 years. The first human ships appeared at the edge of explored space in 2087, emerging from fold space with designs that were crude but undeniably functional. They were trading vessels, their crews insisted, here to establish peaceful contact with neighboring civilizations. The galaxy watched in terrified fascination as these human traders made contact with species after species. They offered technology exchanges, cultural partnerships, and economic cooperation. They smiled too widely, shook hands with grip strength that could crush bone, and spoke of friendship and mutual benefit with enthusiasm that seemed almost genuine. Some species tried to refuse contact, but the humans were persistent. They showed up again and again, always polite, always friendly, always willing to negotiate. They learned alien languages with disturbing speed, adapted to foreign customs with ease, and somehow always managed to find something valuable to trade. Within a decade, human trading posts had been established in 12 star systems. Within 2 decades, human ambassadors were sitting in the halls of the Galactic Council itself, offering their perspective on matters of interstellar policy. The representatives who had advocated for containing humanity watched this expansion with growing horror. They had hoped isolation would keep the humans in check, but instead, it had only given them motivation to break out. And there was something else that worried the older civilizations, something in the way humans behaved, that suggested their friendly demeanor was not entirely sincere. Human traders always seemed to know more than they should about local politics and military capabilities. Human diplomats asked questions that seemed innocent, but were clearly designed to gather intelligence. Human ships had been spotted in restricted areas, observing, recording, learning. The same species that had fought with such savage fury against a Volcari invasion now smiled and spoke of peace, but their eyes told a different story. They were watching, waiting, preparing for something that only they understood. 1,000 civilizations looked at humanity and saw the same thing: a predator pretending to be prey, a warrior wearing the mask of a merchant, a species that had learned to hide its claws but had never truly put them away. Deep in the classified archives of every major civilization, a warning was recorded for future generations. The humans are not what they appear to be. They remember every wrong done to them. They plan for centuries, and they never ever forget. Treat them with respect, give them what they want, and pray that you never give them a reason to remember what they truly are. On Earth, humanity celebrated its emergence onto the galactic stage with festivals and ceremonies. They had gone from a primitive species on the edge of extinction to a recognized power in the interstellar community, and their future had never seemed brighter. But in secret military installations and classified research facilities, other work was being done. The captured Valkyrie technology had been fully decoded, improved upon, and integrated into new weapon systems. Human scientists were exploring physics that alien civilizations had declared impossible. Human engineers were building ships that could challenge any fleet in the galaxy. The humans had learned their lesson from the invasion. The universe was dangerous, and only the strong survived. They would never again be caught unprepared, never again be underestimated, never again be prey. They smiled at the galaxy and offered their friendship, but they built their weapons in silence. And somewhere in the vast archives of human history, a simple saying was recorded that explained everything anyone needed to know about this species. Speak softly and carry a big stick, but make sure the stick is big enough to destroy anyone who threatens you. The galaxy had awakened something ancient and terrible when they invaded Earth, and now they would have to live with the consequences. Humanity was here to stay, and the universe would never be the same.